Okay, I hope that at least your thinking juices have started to run a lot more than before. And I think you will agree with me that this whole area is not simple in terms of trying to understand it, and certainly not black and white. Lots of shades of gray, which is basically where lawyers operate. Okay, so let's look at racial discrimination. And I'm taking this definition from an international document called the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, 1965. This was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1965. And no prizes for guessing that Malaysia has not signed up to this covenant, although there is a campaign, and I'm partly involved in that campaign to try and encourage the Malaysian government to sign up to it. And this is the definition of racial discrimination. So the term racial discrimination shall mean any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. So it's a pretty broad definition. One of the things to note, or a couple of things to note from that, is the fact that religion is not mentioned. Okay, so I mean we'll come to that later if we have the time. But there's an interesting thing about, at least in one definition of racial discrimination, it does not seem to disallow religious discrimination. Okay, and whether or not religious discrimination or religion can or should form a part of an understanding of what race is, obviously that's an interesting question. And secondly, it's a purpose-driven definition. So it's, racial discrimination shall mean this, and that, but the thing is, it has to have the purpose or effect of nullifying the enjoyment of rights, right? So discrimination that doesn't result in a nullification or impairment of the rights of others falls out of the definition of racial discrimination. So again, things for you to think about. And all this is Googleable, on the internet. You just do International Covenant and you will get this. Okay? There are, of course, in the covenant, certain exceptions. And I want to go through them with you because I think it's also important when we try to understand what is or what is not racial discrimination. Okay? So, at least on the surface level, racial discrimination is not preference or restriction between citizens and non-citizens. So if I block someone, or I say you cannot have this because you are not a citizen of this country, that is not in and of itself racial discrimination. The law allows, indeed, as well as I do, when you travel, right? You go to the UK, you go to Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, whatever it is, right? You are treated differently. You have different rights because you are not a citizen, okay? Or maybe you don't pay taxes in that country, so you have no rights, or you don't have certain types of rights, okay? So that's clearly one thing, and of course, connected to that is that, if you have laws about citizenship and naturalization, you can have laws that distinguish, so long as, of course, you don't highlight or earmark any particular nationality, okay? So, for example, Singapore says, we welcome applications for citizenship from all over the world except Malaysia. Then that would be racial discrimination to an extent. But of course, Singapore also has not signed up to this, so, Another exception, and this is a very important one, I apologize that it's long, but it is important. So special measures taken for the sole purpose of securing adequate advancement of certain racial or ethnic groups or individuals requiring such protection as may be necessary in order to ensure such groups or individuals equal enjoyment or exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms shall not be deemed racial discrimination. Provided, okay, there's a big if here, right? Provided, however, that such measures do not, as a consequence, lead to the maintenance of separate rights for different racial groups, and that they shall not be continued after the objectives for which they were taken have been achieved. There's a technical term for this, it's called temporary special measures, TSMs. Okay? So some of you, in answering those questions, you already alluded to this, right? It depends up to what point. After a point, maybe they don't need protection, but before that point, they do. So you have already, brilliantly understood that, in order to avoid racial discrimination, there may well be times when you actually have to pay particular attention to certain types of groups in order to bring them up to where everybody else already is. So that is a preference, right? It is a preference, but it's not racial discrimination from an international law perspective, so long as it doesn't lead to a maintenance, that means there forever kind of thing, maintenance of separate rights for different racial groups, and of course, they are in some ways time-bound until the purpose for which this thing has been introduced has been achieved. Of course, the question is, when is that time? How do you determine whether or not your purposes have been achieved? How do you determine what criteria you use to decide whether or not those objects have been achieved? Okay, so that's an exception. Okay, so another thing that, of course, is in ICET is this whole issue of racial superiority. Okay, so remember 65 is not so long after Nazi Germany and World War II, right? So the idea was to outlaw all kinds of philosophies or thinking that basically promoted theories or ideas of the superiority of one race or group of persons of one color or ethnic origin. And then there's all these issues of racial hatred and discrimination. Okay, so there are a few paragraphs about that. I'm not going to go into detail in each and every slide because in my enthusiasm I prepared about 30 slides and we just don't have the time for all 30 to go through everything. Okay, so again the idea is that you criminalize any kinds of thinking along this way. So of course when you ultimately have to bring this home and think about what is going on in our country, then you have to ask yourselves, well, do we promote, or is there a group or groups that are promoting a form of racial superiority? And the question is, are we doing anything to stop that? Is the law, do we have a law that stops that? And then of course in Malaysia, even if we do have a law, is it being used? And then thirdly, is it being used equally across the board? Some of those questions that you need to think about, okay? Then there are other things about racial discrimination, okay? And just let me give you a 30-second background on international law. So when you have a covenant like this, what the international law does is it creates a committee. And the committee basically monitors what is happening around the world in countries that have signed up to the covenant or convention. And from time to time, they issue what is known as general recommendations, okay, or sometimes you see it as general comments. So again, if you explore the whole area of international law, you will see a lot of these things. And what the committee tries to do in these general recommendations or general comments is to open up and explain further some of the issues in relation to the subject matter of the covenant and sort of explain further their thinking about how these things are developing. Because these are not static. The issue of racial discrimination, like any other issue, is not static. It develops, it changes as time goes by, different circumstances. So from time to time, the committee will come up with, what we call opinions or recommendations. So one of the things here that they mention, and this is where the possibility of race and something else happens, and it's combined together. So you talk about, somebody talked about housing just now, and this reminded me of that. So you talk about actions of private persons, so possibly even something like a housing developer ends up being a private person. Okay, in many cities, I'm reading in the middle, residential patterns are influenced by group differences in income. So I didn't plan this with the question, it's already there. Which are sometimes combined with differences of race, color, descent, and national or ethnic origin, so that inhabitants can be stigmatized and individuals suffer a form of discrimination in which racial grounds are mixed with other grounds. So you get this cross-cutting, intersectional idea of, well, it's race, but it's race and something else, and that becomes something which is discriminatory, right? So for example, it's very interesting that if you go to Sri Hartamas, how many of you been to Sri Hartamas? Okay. How many of you have gone to where Sri Hartamas stops and Segambut Dalam starts? Right? What can you see? Sir, what can you observe? Sorry? The difference in housing. There's, in fact, once you end the condos, there's actually a bare strip of land, about maybe 3 feet wide along the way. And it's just empty. And then beyond that, you get to the Malay reserve area of Segambut Dalam. And the contrast in housing is just stark, you know. One field trip for your church, when they go to Segambut Dalam, walk to that part where Segambut Dalam ends and Sri Hartamas starts. And you will see this idea of two types of Kuala Lumpur, as it were. And to a certain extent, of course, the government intended that because Segambut Dalam is Malay reserve land, right? So developers are not going to go onto Malay reserve land and build expensive condominiums which they cannot sell to non-Malays, right? So that's an economic reason for that. So even sometimes in protection of racial minorities, right, you need to see what are the consequences of that, okay? And certainly that is not something that necessarily helps a particular community. Just because you are protected, and this is one of the other, things that you need to put into the pot, just because you have protection, that doesn't end up making you better off. It could actually be detrimental to you to a certain extent. So we need to be a bit more, I suppose, sensitive and flexible about some of these things. I think that's another definition of racial discrimination. Okay, this is something I recently found. So I talked about race and something else. Here's about race and religion. And this is a writer, I picked it up from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation website. Inhabitants can be stigmatized and individuals suffer a form of discrimination in which racial grounds are mixed with other grounds. That's what I said earlier. And she's talking about a process of racialization to turn an ethno-religious group into a race. So this is where, to a certain extent, either you define a race, a religion suddenly takes on racial distinctives. I think that's what she meant, because she was talking about how the West has stigmatized Muslims as a whole. So, but it's not in the terms of a religious difference, but it's somehow an ethno-religious grouping. And so you see a little bit of that, for example, in Donald Trump's travel ban. He's trying to argue that it's not a Muslim ban per se, and I think there's some sympathy about that. If you look at it, it was not meant to be. But I think, without throwing the language out, I think he's looking at some ethno-religious definition of that. And so that's important to think about. What is the idea of race? And I think if my slides are, okay, let me just go on to this. Okay, and then again, going back to the committee, again, looking at about other aspects of racial discrimination. This is one that they're talking about Indigenous people and how Indigenous people are racially discriminated. So they're deprived of their human rights and fundamental freedoms. In particular, that they have lost their land and resources to colonists, commercial companies, and state enterprises. Consequently, the preservation of their culture and their historical identity has been and still is jeopardized, right? So that's what I talked about, historically underprivileged groups, right? And some of you said, no, I don't agree with about historically underprivileged. Well, maybe we need to think a little bit more about that, because this idea of being treated as a group of people where the government has been overly paternalistic and protective, and where that particular group has not been able to exercise fully its access to rights and fundamental freedoms, is because of this attitude, whether it comes from colonial masters, whether it comes from commercial enterprises, or whether it comes from a very overly paternalistic approach by the state in terms of protecting them, leads them to be a historically marginalized or underprivileged group, and by that reason they become racially discriminated. And so paragraph 5 then talks about the very close connection that Indigenous peoples have with communal lands, territories, and resources. And I think later on we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think there's another slide that I have on racial discrimination. Okay, and then of course there's racial discrimination against non-citizens. So while you accept that there is a legitimate differential between citizens and non-citizens, for example, in the middle of paragraph 3 there, some of these rights, such as the right to participate in elections, to vote, and to stand for election, may be confined to citizens, but human rights are in principle enjoyed by all persons. And then we have to ask ourselves, differential treatment based on citizenship, I'm reading from paragraph 4, based on citizenship or immigration status, will constitute discrimination if the criteria for such differentiation is not pursued or applied pursuant to a legitimate aim. Okay, so the question is, you have those distinctions, but is that distinction legitimate? So for example, if you look at the Malaysian Constitution, right? No, I'm not talking about citizenship, I'm talking about the right to assemble, the right to freedom of expression, the right to join an association or society, what we call the Article 10 rights, assembly, association, and expression. They are only applicable to citizens. So technically, foreign workers cannot join a trade union, right? Foreign workers cannot go out and demonstrate. So the other day when they had a big demonstration in front of the US embassy about the Rohingya, right? Or when UMNO had this rally about Rohingya and they invited Rohingya to come and join. Technically, that was a breach of the law, right? But then you ask yourself, is that a legitimate aim to differentiate between the rights of citizens and non-citizens in terms of freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression? My answer is no. It's not a legitimate aim, because these people have those rights as well, right? But are you saying that you have to grant them all citizenship? Of course not. That's not what I'm saying, right? So you have to be again aware or astute as to what are the differences that will not constitute racial discrimination against non-citizens, but those that will be. So that's what the committee is saying. So racial discrimination, now if you think about it, is not just a narrow idea of racial discrimination, it's broad, but it also has a lot of nuances, a lot of little things that you have to look at and try to understand and internalize. Okay, what did I put this here for? Okay, this is about the idea of adequate advancement. Remember, when you looked at the earlier definition of temporary special measures, they talked about adequate advancement. And so this is, again, the committee trying to explain what adequate advancement is. So it's goal-directed programs which have the objective of alleviating and remedying disparities in the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms, affecting particular groups and individuals, protecting them from discrimination. So you create a preference, as I said earlier, in order to protect a group from discrimination. You may say, but isn't that discrimination as well? Well, it is to a certain extent, but it's not considered to be discrimination because it's being done to alleviate and remedy disparities. So how far do you need to go for these disparities to exist? Are these historical disparities or are they contemporary disparities? Not clear, right? But as long as there is a disparity, then it's something that you need to look into. So for example, in the UK, right, many of the forms in the UK have a section that invite you to fill up disclose your racial identity. It's not compulsory that you have to fill these forms, this section up. It's optional. So for those of you who stood and say, the form should never, that's fine. You don't have to fill that up. But for those of you who want to, it's there for a reason. It's there to be able to provide data and statistics about who are or what is the racial composition of a particular job, particular profession, for example, right? And then you go back and you look at the data and you say, okay, why are there so few Serbo-Croats in this profession? Right? Have we not done enough outreach to the Serbo-Croat community to make them aware that this profession is open to them so that they can have the equality of opportunity to join this profession? So sometimes racial identification is collected to address, to alleviate, and to remedy disparities. So, do we take a blanket view about racial identification in forms? We have to think about that, right? Yes? Well, that's the other thing that from a Malaysian context, you have to ask yourself, all these special programs that the government creates addressing the needs of particular communities, is that right? Is that not right? Do we know enough about what are the targets? What are the goals? Remember, it talks about goal-directed programs. So what are the goals? Right? How do you measure the achievement of those goals? So you can go into a SMART analysis of these goals, right? And is it targeted? Is it appropriate and things like that, right? So you have to ask yourself. So of course, the big program, as it were, that we're all grappling with even until today, almost 60 years after Merdeka, is the new economic policy and its successor policies, right? What was the aim of the NEP and the successor policies? What were the goals? What were the targets? Have we met those targets? If they are not met, then does it justify the continuation of that? For how long? These are all valid questions. But to immediately say that the NEP was wrong, it was racially discriminatory, again, I would venture to suggest that it's not so simple to label it as that. I'm not trying to apologize for the government. I'm not trying to defend the government. I'm just trying to put it to you that there are legitimately different ways of trying to understand these things. And we as responsible Christians should not just simply give in to an intrinsic racial analysis of this, but we need to ask ourselves perhaps more important questions, because this is what justice is all about, right? Just as, to give you a very clear example, you want to talk about equality between, say, gender. So men and women should be treated equally, right? So then I say, okay, women cannot have maternity leave, because that would be discriminatory to men. But we don't think that way, because we recognize certain intrinsic things about women, right? And we say it's not just about simple equality, but it's about effective equality, right? That's the real issue. So if we can understand the difference between simple equality and effective equality in gender, then we have to apply that framework of thinking even to race. What is simple equality, and does that achieve what we want? Or does there have to be effective equality? And then what does that mean? So for effective equality for the Orang Asli may mean one thing. For the Dayaks in Sarawak may mean something else, right? But then so you look at specifically tailored, goal-oriented, goal-directed programs and ask yourself, what is this trying to do? Okay, and then just to be aware, this is something that, since the internet and social media, we've got a lot of racist hate speech going on, and we need to, that also forms part of racial discrimination. Okay, so this is where I'm going to move now from the international scene and look a little bit more domestically, okay? So Malaysia is not unique in the world to have a certain ethnicity mentioned in the Constitution. And for certain ethnicities to have a specific or special provision in the Constitution. I was just confirming with a friend of mine this morning. Singapore has a provision about protection of minorities, and they especially mention the Malay community. So before you start jumping up and down and saying Malaysia is racist, well, okay, maybe you're already jumping up and down because Singapore is racist. But it's there as well. They have a definition. But just a historical curiosity that I think we often forget when it comes to our federal constitution. This is extract from Article 160 sub 2, which is a definition section of our constitution. And this is how a Malay is defined. Okay? So it's basically a 4-limb test. Okay? Not 4 people with the surname Lim, but a 4-limb test. So Malay means a person who professes the religion of Islam, so that's 1. Habitually speaks the Malay language, that's 2. Conforms to Malay custom, that's 3. And then notice there is an and, so that's a 4th one. Most of the time when you speak in public, people forget about this 4th one. They just talk about the first 3, or even more, just talk about the first 1, right? But I think we need to educate ourselves and maybe also educate our friends that there's a 4th limb, and the 4th limb is actually the most important limb, in my view. And that basically, the language is a bit legal, right? But it basically says that you have to trace yourself to a forebear, to a ancestor who was resident in Malaya. I'm talking about Malaya, I'm very specific. Malaya, because it's federation. The federation there is a definition of Federation of Malaya, who was resident in Malaya or in Singapore on Merdeka Day. That's very important. So if you are an Indonesian Malay who has migrated from Indonesia to Malaysia, your ancestors were all in Sumatra, never ever came to Malaya, the Constitution does not call you a Malay. Very important. Very important. Of course, the question then you may ask, sometimes you may not, but I ask, why? Why this definition? Well, this definition, a constitution, is like a contract. Okay? It's a contract between peoples, between those who govern and those who are governed. And our constitution gives certain rights to Malays. Specifically, when it comes to the constitution, the main right is the right to land. Malay reserve land. Right? So what the constitution tried to do, and I think has done, is to make sure that only those who are Malay are legally entitled to occupy, to own Malay reserve land. And to me, that is further emphasized by the connection to the land. Right? So in order to be able to benefit from Malay reserve land, you have to show that you are from this land. That's the only reason you get the land, is because your ancestor was here living on Merdeka Day. Right? So technically, I would suggest that this definition has got nothing to do with religion. Right? This is a definition of Malay not for the purposes of showing you about Islam, but it's a definition purely for the purposes of defining who gets what rights. So, for example, in the famous case of Lina Joy, who was a Malay, nobody disputes that. If she had been allowed, or she went to, because she didn't because she fled the country, right? If she had gone to the Sharia court and got an exit order to say that she was no longer a Muslim, right? She could still be a cultural Malay. She just wouldn't be a Malay for the purposes of the land rights in the Constitution. She could have, so that's the thing that I think, I know it's a separate discourse, but I think that's something that we need to remember and think about. It may be uncomfortable to some of our Muslim friends to understand that, but there is, in a sense, a separate discourse, okay? Yeah, so you know that. So what we have also provided, this Article 8 is the article about non-discrimination, right? Everybody must be treated equally before the law and entitled to equal protection of the law. But, it's a big but, the Constitution allows for discrimination in certain circumstances. And there are basically 5, right? So any provision regulating personal law, and that's where Islam comes in, so you can discriminate between Muslims and non-Muslims on the basis of personal law. But look at C. Any provision for the protection, well-being, or advancement of the Aboriginal peoples of the Malay Peninsula, including the reservation of land, or the reservation to Aborigines of a reasonable proportion of suitable positions in the public service. So we already have a protective provision in our Constitution in favor of a marginalized group, which are, in this case, the Orang Asli. Okay? So we do recognize the need for preference. But again, it's a preference that deals with historical, or the justification for historical, what was the word just now that was used? Historical deficiencies and things like that. So it's there. Okay? So we also have to recognize that. The rest are not quite important for now. Then about Sabah and Sarawak, we talked about movement just now, where you can go or not go, whether they can be treated differently. We actually have that in the Constitution. It's a constitutionally protected right of Sabah and Sarawak, although their names are not mentioned. So this is a freedom of movement. So Clause 2 talks about the right to move freely throughout the Federation, and in this case, the Federation here is the Federation of Malaysia. It's very confusing sometimes, the Constitution, you have to look at it. And to reside in any part thereof, but 3, so long as under this Constitution, any other state is in a special position as compared with the states of Malaya, and the special position is with respect to Sabah and Sarawak. Parliament may by law impose restrictions as between that state and the other states in Malaya on the right conferred by Clause 2 in respect of movement and residence. That's the constitutional provision that sometimes stops people from being allowed to go into Sabah and Sarawak. So it may be discriminatory, but it's there. It's a protective preference in favor of Sabah and Sarawak to make sure, which was the concern in 1963 when Malaysia was formed, that somehow the people from Semenanjung would come and swamp all of them, right? Because we had a greater population than Sabah and Sarawak. So it was there, it was done for a reason. Why did I, Just to talk to you about education, this is the constitutional provision, protection for right to education. So you see very clearly in 12.1, no discrimination against any citizen on the ground only of religion, race, descent, or place of birth in the administration of any educational institution maintained by a public authority, and in particular, the admission of pupils or students or the payment of fees. Okay? So UITM policy of not allowing non-Malays to enter is unconstitutional. Right? But one of the reasons why it's not challenged is because either A, a non-Malay who has applied and got rejected never decide to challenge the decision. And you know, in our legal system, unless you really challenge a decision by a person who has been the victim of that, the courts will throw it out, okay, generally speaking, okay? Or people decided, I'm not going to apply to UITM now, you know. But it's clear, administration of any education institution maintained by a public authority, okay? Of course, some people will quibble, Mara may not be a public authority, but I mean, that remains to be argued in court. Okay, but the other thing is, okay, so that's what I wanted to mention. Okay, so you can have restrictions about religion in terms of, okay, if you're a church, then you can only ask Christians to apply. That's all right. That's provided for by the Constitution. Similarly, if you open a Muslim religious institution and say non-Muslims need not apply, you know, that's again provided for in the Constitution. Okay. So then there's this thing about impartial treatment of federal employees. Very interesting. All persons of whatever race in the same grade in the service of the Federation shall be treated impartially. I think this is one of the most violated provisions of the Constitution. Okay? Now, the famous 153. Famous 153. I think we'll just spend the rest of the time, when the people are already coming back, just to look at it, right? You have to look very, very carefully at 153. First thing is that, the first thing to note, it is a balancing exercise. The Yang di Tuan Agong, basically the executive of the country, on the one hand, is responsible to safeguard the special position of the Malays and natives of any of the states of Sabah and Sarawak, and the legitimate interests of other communities in accordance with the provisions of the article. So it's a balancing test. It doesn't say that you one trumps the other. Sorry to use the word. Such a nice word. And spoiled now, I cannot use it. It's not one over the other. It's a balancing test. That's the first thing you note. Okay. Secondly, paragraph 2. I've underlined it. It's not underlined in the Constitution. I've underlined it. There are 3 areas only that you allow for this preference or this balancing test to occur, right? Positions in the public service. Number 1. Scholarships, exhibitions, and other similar educational or training privileges or special facilities given or accorded by the federal government. 2. 3. Permit or license for the operation of any trade or business required by federal law. Those are the only 3 areas. Anything more than that is unconstitutional. Housing, Bumiputra discounts. Absolutely unconstitutional. But we've never challenged it. Right? When I buy my house from a developer, I don't say, I could have, I suppose I should have, taken it to court, I want the same price. And he said, no, this is a Bumiputra discount. But it's unconstitutional. Maybe would have had a very nice test case with my name on it. Okay, but let's be clear. It's a balancing test, and it's only in respect of 3 areas. Broad areas, no doubt, but only 3 areas. Okay, but you can see, 1957, when this was drafted, you can see why it was there. Right? We can understand why it was there. You go back to the historical, discrepancies and inequalities and things like that. You can see why it's there. And so now moving forward, of course, the moving forward one is probably in terms of permits or licenses, to make sure that if you go into new areas, you make sure that everybody is brought along into that area. So, can be defended, but it has to be very strictly done. This is all just explanation to it. Okay. So this is the Constitution of Singapore, which I mentioned to you. Article 152, close to 153, I don't know why, it wasn't planned that way. Shall be the responsibility of the government constantly to care for the interests of the racial and religious minorities in Singapore. So that's 1. So 1 doesn't mention Malays, but 2 mentions special position of the Malays, who are the indigenous people of Singapore. So that their constitution recognizes that, which is why officially the national language of Singapore is Malay, right? And that's why you sing Majulah Singapura, not Progress Singapore, right? And then just finally some wrap-ups. Again, these are religious requirements. Again, I'm straying a little bit on religion and race. But again, Malaysia is not the only country that has determined some form of religious criteria for high office in the country. In this case, it's heads of state. So you see, you've got Buddhist, Christian, you have others as well. And it's very interesting in Latin America especially, just to make sure that you protect against the Roman Catholic Church. You can't have clergy as candidates. And of course, it also applies to Myanmar. Countries with ethnic identities in their constitution, again, we are not the only ones. And then I think my final slide, countries' constitutions indicate a religious basis for legislation. It's all there. And so finally, again, as I said, I wasn't here, or I didn't see my role as providing you with answers to burning questions that you may have. But I'm here to tease out the issues a lot more and to try to get you to understand and appreciate that the situation, the issues are more complex and sometimes quite fine in terms of where something may be legitimate and something crosses the line to make it unlawful or incorrect. But at the end of the day, I think like what Sivin said, the idea is to challenge you. When you leave this room today, when you leave this building today, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do? I hope to have empowered you a little bit with some legal and factual information, so that going forward, you can look at this issue in a more informed and educated way. And I end with a very important quotation. I told you that my slides did not have any reference to the Bible, not because I don't believe in it, but because I think it's all assumed. But I'm going to end with a quotation from a very important source, which I think we all should do well to remember. And that is this: dark times lie ahead of us, and there will be a time when we must choose between what is easy and what is right. And that comes from that great tome called Harry Potter. Thank you very much.